Hello, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. So, today I plan on talking about something that I thought about after I made my Xbox video, which is I want to discuss my thoughts on the fifth generation of video game consoles, also known as the PS1, Sega Saturn, and 64. So, a little background as I do in most of my videos. So, around that time those came out, I was in high school. I was, we going between sophomore and senior year, depending on the time when those came out. And I actually owned all of them, so I think I actually have a really good ability to speak on the topic of those. It was the only generation uh, that I owned all three of the major consoles at the same time. I actually remember in my bedroom I had a TV splitter set up so I could have all three of them hooked up to my 13-inch television, which I had upgraded it to. If you guys remember the GX TV from Samsung, that's actually the TV that I had for a while. So that 13-inch guy with that sub, and I still have it actually down in my basement. So I know they're pretty collectible now. So, but it's perfect for retro stuff. But yeah, that's what I had. So again, I had all three. I had bought the Sega Saturn used because I could not afford the $399 when it first came out. I ended up getting the N64 on launch day, and then I had gotten the PS1 last, and I got that in, I believe, it was in '97, this fall of '97, because I wanted, or not fall '97, I'm sorry. Actually, maybe it was. Whenever Final Fantasy VII came out, I had, that's when I bought to pick up a copy of Final Fantasy VII. So, yeah, because the N64 came out in '96. So a year later is when I got the PlayStation for Final Fantasy VII. Yeah. So, I was always into video games, but the way I grew up, I didn't have a lot of money to buy a lot, so I had a Super Nintendo, but I'd always rent games. It wasn't until I was older and I was able to get my own job and everything to be able to actually afford those. So I really didn't get into gaming as a serious hobby until I was actually older, which is ironic because I believe that the fifth generation of consoles was the first time in the history of video games, minus maybe the Atari 2600, that everyone saw video games as more than just children's thing, because that's when you started getting all the mature rated games, and it was pretty much a multi-generational. You had kids playing it, you had adults playing it, you had teens playing it. So it was, I think, the first real generation that had all ages, and I mean it showed in the sales numbers. The Genesis and N64 didn't even get to half of what the PlayStation 1 had. The Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis didn't have anywhere near even half what the PlayStation 1 pulled off. I think they pulled off 102 million units. And also, I apologize if I sniffle a few times. I'm actually getting over a cold for this one, so I'm going to sound a little bit more nasally than I normally do in this video. But yeah, so that was actually the first time that I believe that video games became a serious form of entertainment. Before that, I think they'd always been looked at as kind of like a child's activity or a child's hobby, and majority of the games usually faced that way. I mean, yeah, you had your Mortal Kombats, and you had obviously your Night Trap and Lethal Enforcers, everything that caused the start of the ESRB. But for the most part, Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis were still looked at as like kids and teens, thinking nothing that really adults would ever play. So, as we know what happened, so I go back, I was a Nintendo and Sega Genesis kid because my neighbor had a Sega Genesis, and then I had a Super Nintendo, so we'd always go over each other's house and play each other's games on it. But when it came down to the the fifth generation, I definitely was waiting for the N64, and I remember on launch day I got that with Super Mario 64 and Pilot Wings. But I always also secretly wanted a Sega Saturn, mainly because that time was when I started going to arcades as well, and as you can probably tell, because I love motorcycles and cars, I was really big into driving games. And when Sega released the Model 1, Model 2, and the Model 3 arcade boards, that's when you started getting those arcade games that were very realistic. I mean, I used to play pole position back in the arcades at Chuck E. Cheese and things like that. But I remember Daytona USA, I remember Sega Rally, I remember Daytona 2, I love Daytona 2, Scud Race, all those. And so this is the generation of when you got the 3D graphics for racing, and racing games really came into their own. So, and Sega had always made the ones that I always gravitated towards. So I'd always wanted Genesis, or not Genesis, I'm sorry, I'd always wanted a Saturn because they were the ones that had Daytona USA, even though it was a horrible port. And Sega Rally was the first time I can get those things at home. I mean, I remember buying Cruis'n USA, and that was a pale comparison to even the original Daytona, in my opinion, control-wise and everything. So when I got out of high school, I remember I took some of my graduation money and bought a used Sega Saturn and bought a bunch of Saturn games. And I remember really enjoying that. I know that was not a good console for longevity, but I liked a lot of the Sega stuff they published. So let's start at the beginning, right? So obviously, we all know the story. The whole reason why the PlayStation exists is because Nintendo screwed over Sony with the CD attachment when they were making that to go after Sega with their Sega CD. And Sony got so upset that they did a backdoor deal with Philips that Sony pretty much said, continue with the PlayStation, we're going to make our own system. So one of Nintendo's biggest, disses is what caused their greatest rival for many generations. So no one really knew what was going to happen, right? In the beginning of that generation, you thought it was going to be about the N64 versus the Sega Saturn. And that's what all the Nintendo fans were thinking about. But Sony just came out of nowhere. And I think Sony did it for a couple of reasons. So first off, we all know Sega Saturn, the first E3, where they announced, hey, we're releasing the Saturn now. And basically that ticked off a lot of developers who had been hoping to have their games ready for launch, because now it was released 4 months early. They'd only sent it to certain select retailers, and if you remember, like Hebe Toys refused to carry anything Saturn related because they were not part of the initial group that got the Saturn software. So that hurt Sega. Plus, obviously, the Saturn was hard to develop for. If you also know the history of it, the Saturn was really originally made to be the ultimate 2D system. And they kind of shoehorned in 3D in the aftermath of it when they realized that both Nintendo and Sony were going towards 3D. So that's why I know that it's not the best 3D system, because it wasn't really designed to be. But Sega had done that whole E3 conference, and Sony was trying to build a momentum, and they were, courting developers. It's kind of the same way that Sega had courted those developers back with the Super Nintendo to get them to come over to their platform, and then they step on stage, and it's just $299. So $100 less immediately from the Saturn, and obviously everyone's like, okay, I'm gonna wait because this is cheaper. Because as I've said before, Americans vote with their wallet. So if you're looking for a next generation console, and you can get one for $100 less, you'll do that. And as we all know, I think Sega maybe sold 80,000 Saturns in that 4 months before the PlayStation launched. And within the one day, Sony had sold over 100,000 units in the States. So any lead that Sega had was demolished the first day they launched. And that just set the tone for the CD-based. And I remember there was a lot, a lot of people don't know this, but Tomb Raider was originally developed for the Saturn, and then it was ported to the PlayStation, which then became a PlayStation staple. The A lot of developers kind of jump ship with the Saturn. There's so many, you always hear about so many unreleased Saturn games that they stopped mid-development because they just couldn't sell the consoles. And for the most part, Sega was really the only one manufacturing. I mean, the last year of the Saturn, they had 5 releases, and majority of them, I think, was, besides a couple from Working Designs, were Sony themselves or Sega themselves, and those are some of the rarest games on the Saturn. Makes you wish I still had them. But so the war between Sega and Sony became the disc-based systems, and Sony just obliterated it. But then the N64 came out, and Nintendo, in their kind of hubris ways, didn't want to do anything with piracy because obviously CDs were easy to pirate. They wanted to have complete control, so they stuck with cartridges. And they did it for piracy reasons. They wanted to be able to, number one, control how many cartridges were made because you had to order them from Nintendo. So Nintendo could say, oh, you want to publish this game, we're making you purchase X amount of cartridges. Whether it sells or not, that's not our issue. This is what you have to pay. And they had to pay, sometimes I believe, up to $40 for a cartridge, depending on the size. Whereas a CD costs a couple dollars to manufacture. So now you're having a whole bunch of developers not wanting to develop for the N64, because why would they? It's costing so much more to do it. There's no guarantee. Plus, they have to compress so much of a game down to and fit in a cartridge. One of the things that Nintendo lost was that RPGs that were always known for Super Nintendo, and they all went to the PlayStation, which obviously in Japan, RPGs are king, and they definitely were back in the 32-bit era, 64-bit era. So you lost the final blow of Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy. These were huge system sellers that would have easily sold 3-4 million copies on whatever platform they were on, and then they just handed it to Sony. Nintendo lost so much because of that, because they wanted to stick with the cartridge format, and then they did the 64 DD, which they half-heartedly released over in Japan, didn't do very well. So. But one thing that the N64 did well was platformers, and they did, obviously, Nintendo franchises very well. And they did a lot of decent racing games. Like, I remember San Francisco Rush was one of my favorite ones on that, and then Rush 2 was on there. Beetle Adventure Racing, they had the Extreme G series, and then when they also ported a few of the Sony ones, so they had Wipeout 64, which is great. I remember I had Ridge Racer 64. So they definitely had good racings, which for me, obviously, I enjoy my racing games. But as we all know, Sega just was unable to keep up with the competition from Sony, and they abandoned that after a few years when Bernie Stolar famously said the Saturn is not our future, which basically any third party that was manufacturing games for the Saturn just said, you know what, we're done. Which also then hurt them a lot with the Dreamcast, enough where EA wouldn't even publish for it. A lot of bonehead moves by Sega. I think they could have done a lot better. And I know that Tom Kalinske had mentioned multiple times that he knew the American market, but Sega Japan pushed too much for like the add-ons for the Genesis, and just a whole bunch of just bonehead moves, in my opinion, that kind of killed a once great hardware and software manufacturer. I mean, they're still around software, but most of their IPs don't even get used. I mean, they just announced that they're bringing back Crazy Taxi, but there's so many IPs they have that they just have not touched in decades that I would love to see revived, but it is what it is. So Nintendo comes out, they come out of their gate swing because it's Nintendo, and obviously Nintendo had their first party stuff. They had GoldenEye, they had all the party games. It was the 4 players, it was, no load times, but the games looked horrible because of the RAM limitations. And like I said, a lot of developers left the N64 alone because it was too high a cost and too much a risk. I know that Capcom only published 2. I want to say one was definitely Resident Evil 2, which was amazing what they could do with that. comparatively, considering that was a PlayStation 2 dual disc. And I want to say the other one was a Mickey game of some sort. I don't remember exactly. But you also had the whole, I mean, thanks to Nintendo, they popularized analog controls. Because if you think about it, when both the Saturn and the PlayStation came out, it was still all digital. They had the standard cross key variant. I mean, Sony's was a variant, so they didn't have to pay licensing fees. And Nintendo came out with their 3D analog stick for Super Mario, and then obviously Sony developed the DualShock, and Sega developed Nights into Dreams with their old analog stick. So, a lot of innovations came out of this generation, and it was the generation where Nintendo, just other than with the Wii, which is just not even really competing against the 360 or PS3, Nintendo just kind of lost that domination they had. They kept their hardcore fans. To this day, they still have them with the Switch 2 and things, and obviously their handhelds. But it hurt Nintendo in the long run with a lot of things. And like I said, I had all three, so I can speak to all of them. I will say this, that while I did enjoy the PlayStation, it was not my favorite console. I don't know if that was because I had a misguided anger at Sony for ruining Sega, because I didn't like what they had done. I did have a lot of games on my PlayStation, though. I obviously had Gran Turismo, some Ridge Racers. I did the Metal Gear Solid. I did, obviously, I was very big into Japanese role-playing games back then. I still am, I just don't have the time for them anymore. But I was very big into Japanese role-playing games, so I would get, I remember Wild Arms, obviously the Final Fantasies, Saga Frontier, what was some other one? I'm trying to think. Anything Squaresoft published, I had. That was my big, obviously, because they were just like the kings of that. And Sega had some of their own as well. I remember they had Shining in the Darkness. They had the Dragon Force. A lot of them working designs. Magical Ninth Ray Earth. So they had their own RPGs, but they just weren't up to the same, in my opinion, the same caliber as your blockbuster Sony Squaresoft releases. And obviously, that Sony did that huge marketing push for Final Fantasy VII that so many people bought the game not even realize what it was, because they just showed the cutscenes. I mean, that was one of the best bait and switches in the history of video games. If you didn't know what an RPG was, you bought this game thinking about all this action, you end up having turn-based. But I think that turned on a lot of people to this genre. I remember being in Electronics Boutique, and someone in front of me was buying a Lundra for the PlayStation, and his friend was asking him, what kind of game that is, and he goes, "Oh, it's an action role-playing game." And I'll tell you, these two kids looked like traditional high school jocks. They had the sports team shirt on. They were definitely either basketball or baseball with the local high school. And here they were playing role-playing games. And I've met so many people later on that were huge role-playing game fans that you wouldn't think were role-playing games because of what Sony was able to do to the genre. So it was good. I mean, they pushed role-playing games into the forefront. They introduced 3D with both Nintendo and Sony. Now, Nintendo's 3D, while blurry and lower polygons, because of that, you can still play Super Mario 64 today and it still looks great, even upscaled, because the lower polygon count and the lower memory. Where if you try to do that with a lot of the 3D PlayStation games, they do not look good. They had the weird warping thing going on. That was a constant look for the PlayStation. And obviously, you had a lot of the PlayStation issues with the first few revisions, that you had to turn them upside down to use them because the laser would wear out. But there was so many just great franchises that went on. And when Sony finally, I remember that Sony also had the no 3D rule, or no 2D rule, because they wanted to push the fancy, high powerful new 3D stuff. And I remember that it was a blessing when Symphony of the Night came out, because that was a high-end 2D game on the PlayStation, and they later on, softened their stance on 2D. And I remember thinking about this a while ago when they brought up those classic systems. You got to remember those, the NES Classic and the Super Nintendo Classics, and they brought the Sony Classics, and they had a decent selection of games. But the problem is that because there were so many different games and so many genres, and because the PlayStation had hit so many different types of people, you could talk to 10 different Sony gamers and they would all play completely different games. Whereas if you go to a Nintendo gamer, they all had Mario 64, they all had GoldenEye, they all had Mario Party, they all had Mario Kart. There was just the core games that if you were a Nintendo fan, you had, because that's what you bought. Whereas you could have the total sports only guys were happy. You'd have the RPG guys. You'd have the platformers. You'd have everyone had a different type of game they loved on the PlayStation. They had the horror games, and everyone was a little bit different, which was great for their system, because honestly, again, it brought gaming into the mainstream. Everyone could find something that they liked, and you weren't pigeonholed to playing certain types of games. And obviously, thanks to Sony, with the exception of some of the missteps in the PS3 era, they've been the dominant force in home console games ever since. The PlayStation 2 sold, I want to say, well over 150,000 or 150 million. I don't know the exact number, but I know it was even more than the PlayStation 1. At the end of the day, the PlayStation 3 did eventually overtake the Xbox by about 5 million. The PlayStation 4 obviously destroyed the Xbox One, doubled it to sales, and even though I'm a huge Xbox fan, the PlayStation 5 is destroying the Series X when it comes to sales. And that momentum, for the most part, it's all started in the PS1 era. I know you don't have the kind of the retro nostalgia that a lot of people do yet for the old Nintendo franchises. Obviously, your Mario, Zeldas, those are just going to be eternal IPs that are worth, everything. There's not a lot of eternal, in my opinion, Sony IPs, because even some of their biggest IPs, Crash Bandicoot, and a lot of the Sony exclusives, eventually the series came to other consoles. So they didn't have a lot. In the beginning, they had a lot of exclusives, but they didn't move on. I also remember with the PlayStation having rhythm games. It was the first time you could get, if you like puzzle games, there were so many puzzle games. There was the rhythm games like Parappa the Rapper, and fighting games. I mean, if you wanted fighting games, yeah, you had a lot. You had a bunch of 2D fighters on the Saturn, and then you had Virtual Fighter and Fighting Vipers, and you had all those, but you had a lot more on the PlayStation. Going back to the Saturn, one thing they did do well for the most part was the Saturn developed ones. I mean, not the original Daytona USA looked horrible because it was rushed, probably an extra 4 months for development, but it played very similar to the arcade, even though it had 20 frames per second frame, which was nothing like the 60 that was in the arcade cabinet. And they released the Champion Circuit Edition, which the cars didn't handle the same. So, but Sega Rally was good. I actually even enjoyed Sega Touring Championship. And then they also had, I remember, Manx TT for motorcycles, even though that was only one course, but you could use the analog stick with that. That was a really fun game. Like I said, Sega did have some of its own role-playing games. They did get some ports of Sony games eventually. Like I remember Resident Evil came out for it. They had their own version of Wipeout on it, which I played. They had their own version of Destruction Derby. But it didn't have, and I know in Japan it did a lot better in Japan, but in America it just floundered. But also a fun fact is, when I was growing up, I never had the money for a computer. And when I graduated high school in '97, So I had a couple friends that had computers, but we never had the internet or anything. If I had to use a computer, I'd go to their house, or I'd have to use it in school. So my first foray into the internet was the Sega Netlink. If anyone remembers that, it was a little modem you plugged into the cartridge slot, memory card slot of the Saturn, and it let you online. And that was my first experience with going online, being in chat rooms, and things like that. And I remember it was a lot of fun. Some of the people that I met in those Sega chat rooms, I'm still online friends with today. And obviously during that whole time when the Saturn was dying, we still went to the Netlink channels and we would talk about the Dreamcast. So there was a very nice community. I will say this: there was an amazing community for the Sega Saturn. I wish they could have done more with it. I wish we'd gotten a lot more of the import stuff in. I wish they'd released that RAM card to let X-Men versus Street Fighter come over, so you didn't have to import it. They had a lot of great light gun games, so it's a very unique system that I wish it done better, but it made the Dreamcast even that much more, which I will do at some point, a retrospective, probably in the Dreamcast itself, because I loved that system, probably one of my favorite systems of all time, as well as the 6th generation. And fun fact, I don't know if you guys knew this, but so when Sony was launching their PlayStation, they didn't have enough game cases for their games to be released. So a lot of the first title releases on the PlayStation were actually using Sega Saturn game cases that Sony had sold them, so they were able to actually stock their games and put them on the shelves before they had that cardboard bumpy one they had. So they even helped. Sega's kind of even helped with the PlayStation. So that's kind of my take on that whole generation as a whole. I would say my favorite system from that generation, at the end of the day, would probably have to be the N64, only because I have more fond memories of it. And even though there was less games, the games you did have, they were quality. So a lot of them had a lot of quality to them. I would play those over and over again. I remember playing Blast Corps, all the way through Perfect Dark. You had the Golden Eyes. You had obviously your Zeldas. You had Mario. After that, I would say my second favorite would be the Saturn, minus with an asterisk there. I preferred the PlayStation RPGs. Those were my favorite. I spent more time on those RPGs. I remember when Final Fantasy 9 came out, which is probably my favorite Final Fantasy. I had bought it, and I was dating a girl who lived about an hour and a half from me. And the whole time I was playing Final Fantasy, I would just bring my PlayStation with me to her house. And I would just, because I'd spend the night and things, and I'd plug into her TV in the bedroom, and I'd be playing Final Fantasy, and that my PlayStation literally stayed with me that entire time playing Final Fantasy. But yeah, let me know in the comments what you guys think about the 5th generation. I think, like I said, I think it brought the gaming into the mainstream. It opened up a whole bunch of new franchises. It turned gaming really into what it is today. But let me know in the comments. If you like these kind of videos, let me know. Please like, please subscribe. I hate saying that, but I would like to get, again, I keep saying in my videos, I want to get this channel to grow. I'd love to have a community. I love having discussions with people.